And so it got me to thinking about something that I've been thinking about for a very long time. What does it mean to be South African? What does it mean to be African? What does it mean to... Hi everyone and welcome to Strangers. My name is Zainab Taonga Chirwa and I'm really excited to have you here and to welcome you into the space. It's been a long time coming. It feels like an extension of, not it feels like, it is an extension of the work that I've been doing over the past almost close to a decade now. For the most part, I spent it in uni studying, trying to understand governance structures and systems. Governance, community, what's the connection there? Well, the connection is very much there, right? Is that what governance tries to do is to regulate and to organize a community or an organization. But yeah, essentially a community, right? And they to make sure that it thrives, that they achieve their objective, and that the way people interact with one another do not come at the cost of the collective objective. And also to protect like all the different interests as well, right? Talking about when we talk about leadership, when we talk about governance, that we keep in mind that at the core of it is we're trying to build communities that thrive, that protect the interests of all members within a community. It doesn't mean that it is not possible for you to apply every single form of ideology. In every era, in every community, there will be a dominant way of being and thinking. And so it's not to mean that that remains to be the case forever and ever. Amen. We should definitely continue to question it, and even possibly look at like switching it up and thinking about it like in a different way, or like what can we replace it that's even better, or maybe modifying it as well. So Strangers is really a combination of all of that. Is at the core of it is that we're trying to build community, trying to build societies, and I think it would be a disservice if I didn't address this matter as well, because it's such a topical thing at the moment, where we see that a lot of countries around the world, not just like here in South Africa, but like in other African countries, in Europe, in North America, in Asia, you see this like super nationalist movement that's happening, where there's this movement to say that we need to bring back our countries, we need to restore our countries to be to maintain our national identities and heritage, because it has been infiltrated by the other, by the stranger. And I really struggle to accept or understand what that means. I think maybe it's a language that I disagree with, right? I agree that there definitely is a need for us to rethink how we govern migration, how we regulate movement. When it comes to trade laws, trade laws are always the most advanced laws, and they're the easiest laws to, in comparison to others, to be able to be passed, right? Because capital's interests always are number one, and they're also the most funded. Right, it's easier to move cargo, like I said earlier, than it is to move human beings, for people to move around. So I think what the conversation is that the system is breaking because immigration laws that exist speak to a world that no longer exists anymore. You have people moving around as they've always done since time immemorial, whether it was people trying to move, on voyages, going from the Americas or Europe, trying to go to the Far East, or people in the Far East, going to, the quote unquote Near East, people across, within a continent moving around. People have always moved. It's not a new thing. And I think we need to also talk about that it's not, just because in the interest of governance and regulation, we have established these borders, right? They're very much quite arbitrary, especially like, in Africa. We talk about this a lot when we talk about the scramble for Africa, how a lot of our boundaries, our nation states, a lot of the conflicts that exist within a lot of countries and between countries is because our borders just don't make sense, right? That they divided, they cut through existing communities, and communities will not cease to exist just because you said, oh, you belong here, I belong there. Like, they are human relationships that are involved there. So really just addressing that as well, and thinking about, especially with agentic AI right now, and large language models, and the way the advances that are happening with artificial intelligence, we are possibly going to see a movement away from nationalism and moving away from this emphasis, overemphasis of national identities. It's probably going to be a class thing, but even there, it's still underpinned by existing notions of social organizations. So I'm really excited to talk about digital governance, democracy, and democracy, and the relationship between those two things. Looking at how communities, societies, countries are organized, and building bridges between the youth and young people from across the world, especially the young people of Africa. Most of us, if not all of us, are facing the same problems in our countries, and it's only when you look over the fence, over the wire, you realize that, oh my goodness, the kids next door are literally facing the same issues of high unemployment rate, um, you know, inheriting, leadership and government with very old people who are out of touch with reality, who, are still wanting to hold and control and decide the future of the country based off of their worldview of 50 years ago, 30 years ago, with very little and very few young voices to also, contribute towards that. And so, what as young people, what do we do? There's been incredible examples of young people coming together, organizing, and actually being able to vote, change regimes, to try something out, to try something new. Whether it has worked out or not is another conversation, but there's definitely something to learn, and perhaps maybe this is the nudge and for you to start believing that you can change, that there is a possibility that when we organize as young people, that we can change the system in our countries, in our regions, for our communities. I have always considered governance as something that people at the top or people in authority do, people who know it all and know how to organize us as a society, as a world, or as communities, and they fix our problems, right? Um, they are products of their interactions with the world, with people, with just everything around them. That definitely has an impact in terms of how they go about, how they think about the world, how they think about the best way in which we organize the world, and how do we sustain the community that we build, right? And so the two are not separate. And story time number one. I back in COVID during hard lockdown 2020, I found myself doing this like virtual fellowship through Stanford. Well, not the university, but a group of students at Stanford. And I met some really cool people. Surprisingly, no one on my fellowship was actually American. Um, yeah, actually, because my facilitator was German. Yeah, he was German, and everyone else was like a Spanish person, a Czech. What do you call it from Czech Republic? I don't know. Chechen? Is it Chechen? Czech? I don't know. If you're someone from the Czech Republic, please comment, or if you know, yeah, please tell me. We're just a bunch of group of people around the world in COVID, thinking about and learning about what are the best ways in which you go about making a difference in the world, right? We had a common ground. I think at the core of it, our motivations was to have a positive impact on the world. There was certain aspects of our motivations that differed as well, of course, but at the core of it, that is what we was, so that is what we prioritized. What exactly am I doing here? What is the best way in which I approach this? And also realizing that different contexts require different ways of doing things. But the world will tell us that there are very few things that we would possibly have in common, or even if we were to meet in a social setting, the chances of any of us coming together, like all four of us coming together to sit and have a conversation about this sort of conversation, would probably be quite slim and low, because the quote unquote natural, or more, perhaps not quote natural thing, but the socialized thing to do is would have been for us to look for people who looked like us, who maybe spoke the same language, who maybe came from the same countries, who maybe came from the same cultures, maybe even come from the same religion, just finding a common ground of an identity marker that we may have. And so that's what we would use to try and to scout out a room to find out who can I stand next to or sit next to for me to sit and connect with. And yet here we were, a common purpose, searching, right, for questions. We found ourselves in this room talking and spending a good 6 weeks or so, almost 2 months, thinking about these questions quite deeply. And this has been a consistent pattern, is that realizing how, um, you know, we're socialized to think that we can only connect and find a mutual ground with people who look like ourselves, who think like us, who share a common background. But realizing that there are so many ways in which we can connect with one another as human beings, and there's so much, and we miss out on, and could possibly have learned about ourselves and even other people and the world around us if we had just taken a chance and gotten to know and connect across the aisle with the next person. And so that's what Strangers is about, right? It's embracing this thing that we have, that as much as, we have the internet and the social media where more connected, we share so much about our day and how we spend it, what we ate, where we went, our thoughts, our deepest fears sometimes, you find that some people find it very easy to share their emotions online than they would if they were able to do so in person. But it has, in many ways, made the world smaller, but it has also still maintained these compartments, right? That, we still don't know one another. We very much still curate what we present of ourselves. And more importantly, when we look at algorithms and just how, especially social media platforms are designed, is that, your algorithm will show you content that is more aligned to what you have previously shown an interest in, and what will, I found that quite frustrating, quite unfair, that why are you going to show me things that I already know of, or people that I already know? Like, I've come onto the internet to connect and meet people that I don't know and learn about things that I don't know about. So show me something different. It's not to say that, learning can only happen in places where we don't know, but I think, there's something to be said about, how we think about algorithmic bias, how whether it's, the companies behind these social media platforms think deeply about how they design these algorithms that allow us to see content from wherever, they find ourselves. Whether is it based on location, is it based on mutual interests, how much the mathematics behind it, in terms of, how much leeway do they provide for you to be shown content that would necessarily never have come across, or it's not within your circle of people that you follow, and so many ways, as much as we've come to know and connect with each other online and I wouldn't say in person as much, well, even in person, we still remain strangers. What makes that even more dangerous is, you see this shift in the world, in many parts of the world. I'm from South Africa, and call ourselves a rainbow nation. It's a very diverse country. Fortunate that we only think of our diversity in terms of race, that we don't talk about it in terms of our diversity, in terms of even just like cultures, in terms of language, in terms of ethnicities, in terms of even in terms of nationalism as well. In that, we have people who have roots in other parts of the world and who have found themselves here. Whether people have roots from other parts of the world from 300 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, 50 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago. But it's such a melting pot of different cultures. But we still find ourselves that, as much as it's, it's nurtured and protected, that's the beautiful thing, that, that the law here really does try to protect diversity. We still want to, when you're different, you have to be a specific type of different, right? For you to be accepted, for you to fall under the diverse South African. What is that? And this is not just an anomaly here in South Africa. You find that in like everywhere in the world, right? I was thinking about this, like for instance, as a product of the Fees Must Fall movement, we thought quite deeply and rigorously about how do we fight colonial thinking and white imperialist thinking across the board, a reimagining of the world outside of this, mono hegemony, that the world can only be organized in this manner, this one way of thinking, as though, this is the only lens through which we see the world. Why is it that it's only when it comes to non-white people who, when they define themselves in terms of nationalism, they will always be defined, they do always be attached with the prefix, right? So, for instance, here in South Africa, if you are if you're someone who has roots in another part of the continent, of the African continent, for you, it is not socially um accepted for you to just be able to say, oh no, I'm South African, as well as, that I call multiple homes home. And so that I'm South African and I am Zambian. I'm South African and I am Congolese. I'm Zambian and I am Zimbabwean and I am from Lesotho. I am from Eswatini, right? Like even like back home in Zambia where, I was born and spent the first 8 years of my life. I went to a school where almost less than 5% of my classmates were Zambian. So in a class of 28 kids, I remember, just counting, like, actually, how many of us were actually like Zambian? Probably less than five of us were Zambian in that class, right? The rest, everyone else was from like all over the continent and the subcontinent. So it was a Muslim country. It was a Muslim school, sorry. So for the most part, most of the students who went there were predominantly Muslim countries, right? So you'd find a lot of West African, East Africans, some North African. Um, you in Southern Africa, we also had some like Angola and Mozambique students as well. We had from India, from Bangladesh, and so that was also just like a melting pot. The playground was literally a melting pot. Uh, I always think about this, like when I went to preschool, my so my desk mate, right? Her name was Samira, and she is first generation. So she was first generation. Basically, her parents are from India, and I don't know if Samira, I don't know if you remember this, and I don't know why we've never spoken about this. This is actually quite weird. Next to each other, I she couldn't speak a word of English, and she only spoke Gujarati. I was able to speak English and like my mother tongue, Tumbuka and Nyanja. So and she couldn't speak either of those. So there was obviously a language barrier. But somehow, so she would speak her Gujarati and I would speak in English. And somewhere, somehow, I don't know, we would communicate and we got each other, we understood each other. And that's how it went until, over the next few months, Samir obviously picked up English and we started conversing English because that became our common language, right? But now, like fast forward more than 20 years later, I was able to connect with her and I'm speaking to her. She's moved back, she's married now, has a family, um, moved back to India and she finds and we're now able to we're texting and so we're talking on WhatsApp and here we are. She's gone back to her quote unquote her roots or home, but Zambia will also be home, is home for her as well. I'm not in Zambia anymore. I find myself in South Africa. um we're talking in English, but we're speaking Nyanja, and it's so organic, and and I said, oh my goodness, wow, why don't we share like there's very little representation of this out there on the online space of people like us, kids like us who grow up in the diaspora, and how our identities are so diverse and so it's a mixed thing, it's like almost like this like tapestry. And yes, there are examples of it, in terms of like, for instance, I think in whether it's like, kids growing up in the diaspora in the US or in Europe, there's a great representation of that. But there's very little of that, especially like here in Southern Africa, what you see more of is really these conversations around nationalism of, belonging and not belonging, like, we all know, like so many people here in South Africa either know a family member, are one, or they know someone who has married someone or has had a child with someone from another African country, and so they're like part of the community. It's not a foreign thing. It's not a weird thing. It's a very common thing, and not just like people of Nigerian descent, people of Zimbabwean, of Malawian, um, descent. Like these are, Zambian people from like everywhere, from Eswatini, from Lesotho. People have all this different heritage, but it's like once you come onto the national stage, there's a specific brand. There's only one accepted brand of being a nationalist. And this is not just like unique to South Africa alone. You see this even in the world of sports, where you saw this quite a lot. For instance, there's this really famous football player. His name is Mario Balotelli. He was raised in Italy, and so his whole life, all he's known is Italy. He speaks Italian. That's his mother tongue. I remember when he started playing for the national team, for the Italian national team. It was like this huge hoo-ha, not just like in Italy, but even just like across the world. It was like, oh my gosh, this guy, this black man, this very dark black man is Italian, playing for the Italian national team. I remember like even the cameras, and even especially in the Italian media, they would zoom in on him as as the teams would play the national anthems, right? And so when the teams would line up and they would play the Italian national anthem, would put this camera and bring the camera like really close up in his face, to like see if his lips were moving correctly, to see if he was singing the national anthem accurately, because it seemed so mind-boggling that this black person could be Italian. And I remember that like sticking with me, because I was just like, wow. Because I guess it stuck with me, because I was like, oh my goodness, this is something that I have also struggled with, of those questions of belonging. Not that I didn't know or had any identity issues, or not knowing where I belonged, or where I'm from, or my identity, but really almost trying to convince people, and of like, oh, this is where I'm from, or this is how I identify myself. Just feeling accepted, or feeling, or being able just to explain myself, and not being seen as weird, or not getting these weird looks, or this facing rejection, of saying no, you don't. I remember in uni there was this girl. I've just been like, I grew up in South Africa for grown up here for the most part of my life, and so when I went to uni, yeah, I was able to reconnect with like other Zambians, and the Zambian girl was telling me, oh, Zay, I don't think that sometimes I don't know about your loyalties here. It's like sometimes you're South African, sometimes you're Zambian. So, so I don't know like where you stand. And I remember like that has stuck with me to this day. Like it's something that I think about, not that I hold like any like strong bad feelings towards this person, right? But it hurt me. I think that's what I need to say. Right? I need to say that like it was so hurtful in the moment, and it still triggers that sort of like insecurity that was in me for a long time. That why does society require me to? Why does the world require me to choose one place and call that home? When I'm a product, like who I am, and being someone who's able to call multiple places home is not a new thing. This is something that's always been there. People have moved around since forever. People have migrated since forever. But I guess we live in the age of nationalism, right? So you must belong to a country, and you must belong to one country. But I think we're way past that. And so when we still continue to try and hold on to this thing of like, people have these like cookie cutter identities, that you're just one thing. Of course there are people like that, right? But there's also a significant number of people who continue to move around in the world. Like immigration is a very common uh human thing, that this is something that has always happened. But I think what has in modern times, it has become acceptable, and and I guess you can bring it down to economics, right? The powers that be, the people who make laws, again, see the connection between community building, black building communities, and governance, right? Is that it's easy for you to move cargo around the world than it is like legally. It's easier to move cargo around the world legally than it is to move for human beings to move around in the world. And for me, like that's crazy, right? A big part of liberty, a big part of independence is that that as a human being, you should be able to move around as much as you should. Now, of course, there is reason as to why it needs to be regulated, right? But it should definitely not be demonized. It shouldn't be a thing of like, oh, people should just be like, you should stay where you are and I stay here. But it's like, no, that would fly if that applied to everyone, but that doesn't apply to everyone, you know. And like for instance, like look at how when you look at, let's say it's like if you go to the US, right? Um, White Americans will only be defined as Americans. They are not going to go around or filling in a form and calling themselves, I am Irish American. Um, I am whatever, German American. Eh, oh, yeah, yeah, right. The only ones who actually do it's a thing, who have maintained that or sustained that is Italian American. And if you look at the history of that, is that Italians have never been fully considered as Caucasian historically, right? So you find that Black Americans will be referred to as African American or Black American. You don't find a white person in America who's American being identified as white American. They're just American. Or if you are someone who has South American heritage, you will be a Hispanic American. You'll be a Latino, Latina American. There's Caribbean Americans. And so it's just like this is the extent. And so you see the extent of white supremacy, right? Is that it establishes whiteness as the standard in which you exist in the world, and everyone else is almost you define yourself and you exist um in relation to white hegemony in white supremacy. And when I speak about this, for those who don't understand, this is not an attack on like white people as just like an ordinary white person moving around. I'm talking about the system, because even white people themselves are also victims of it, right? In this, that's a whole lot of things, and we'll talk about that, in subsequent episodes. White supremacy is that what it does, and it works together with patriarchy, with capitalism, of creating this one way of existing, of thinking in the world, and it is determined by a group of people. And so anything that is other is to a large extent illegitimate, and so you constantly have to work hard to legitimize yourself in this world, which again goes back fundamentally to like the legitimacy of all human beings, right? So you come back here to South Africa, you find in some terms of like how we define ourselves, in terms of how we identify ourselves. So, strangers. So what's that about? Essentially, I think we're strangers. I think that we don't know each other. We don't we still, as much as we have the internet that allows us to, you can follow anyone from around the world and get to know about, their food and their cultures and the music and their art. We still only see what is curated, and we only see dominant cultures, right? And dominant cultures aren't they're dominant in the sense that they most of the time they have more numbers, but also access, right? So if you have access to the internet, you have access to, if more of you within your community has access to the internet, then your culture will be represented more online. So Strangers is an effort to try and sort of bridge that access barrier. It is not a complete solution to the problem, but I think it's an attempt at getting different voices, getting us to know one another, and especially as Africans, not just as Africans on the continent, but also Africans in the diaspora. A lot of us, a lot of the conversations, when it's time to show out and show off our cultures, we're here. It's great, it's vibes. But when it comes to now, when it comes to conversations around, you know, um, identity or nationalism or coming together as a community, like how we relate with one another, I think there's a lot of work and important work that is needed. And it's really, really sad and heartbreaking, to look when you look at a number of incidents that constantly come up of how we exclude, we ostracize one another. We can be so hurtful, so discriminatory against one another. And two things can exist, right? Two truths can exist. You can talk to, for instance, a lot of times, when people talk about when what oh what's the beef between people from this country and that country, a lot of it has to do with just like social human ills, right? So like criminality or crime is just that, it's crime, and crime um is perpetrated is by all human beings. And so when we talk about that, then we should talk about like, listen, these people are criminals. Why are we, why do they behave the way they do? Why do they do this? And of course, that needs to be regulated. That needs to be, it needs to be, they need law enforcement has to come into place. But it becomes dangerous when you now start using like a brush and you just whitewash and you brush over everyone and then just say, hey, everyone who represents this identity is this thing, and so we can never, be associated with them, etc., etc. I think that's quite dangerous and it's quite unfortunate. Strangers is that trying to connect people. It's also informed by there's a verse in the Quran in Surah Hujurat, that says the way Allah says, God says that we have created you into different nations and tribes so that you may know one another. The Surah Hujurat, or you can call it a book, I guess. It's called Surah Hujurat, and Hujurat translates into compartments or rooms. And the tafsir in terms, interpret this to mean that that human beings are exactly human beings, or different groups of human beings are exactly that. Our compartments are these rooms, and so it's a way, it's God acknowledging that we are, we have been created naturally into these different forms of beings, right? But the whole essence of it, the reason behind this difference, is that we get to know one another, and so to understand each other's boundaries, are being able to understand how to coexist, and still be able to connect and realize that at the essence, at the core of it, that there is this, people ultimately all just want to be loved, to be accepted, and they want to be protected, and yeah, you just want happiness, and you're seeking, you're looking for something. It's, the search for something, for meaning, for purpose, has been called many things, and I guess this is a space also where we'll be talking about that as well, of like searching for meaning. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing the conversations that I've already had and that I will have with amazing, incredible people. So yeah, please like, follow, and subscribe, and I look forward to that. I'm really excited. It's time for for all of us to embrace the stranger in ourselves, to embrace the stranger in others. That it's not things that are strange, or people that are strange, or what we deem as strange, is not always a bad thing. They you should see it as something, as an exciting opportunity to get to know something new. And so embrace that in yourself, embrace that in other people, and always remember that everyone is as human. Everyone is human, and the very things that you look for, that you want, that you crave, the next person does as well. And so it's not to say that it's this like romantic thing of how we, romanticizing people or human beings, that all experiences of trying to do that will be positive, but we try. And so if you connected with any of the things I've spoken about today, please like, follow, subscribe, and thank you for coming around, and welcome to the neighborhood. Like, follow, subscribe. Take care, and be kind to one another.